There was a time when the Arabian Peninsula was one of the poorest, harshest, most forgotten places on Earth. We are talking about a strip of scorching desert where men dove into freezing waters hoping to find pearls that might feed their families for another season. Where nomads rode camels across endless dunes, where starvation was common and clean water was treasure. There were no roads, no hospitals, no schools. The people of this region survived on dates, a bit of camel herding, some fishing, and whatever scraps of trade came through the ancient routes. The outside world barely knew these lands existed, and frankly, it did not care. Now look at them. Look at Dubai, with its impossible skyline piercing the clouds, the Burj Khalifa standing at 828 meters as the tallest structure humans have ever built. Look at Abu Dhabi managing sovereign wealth funds worth trillions of dollars, funds so massive they could purchase entire countries if they wanted. Look at Qatar, a tiny nation that was once a footnote on a map, now hosting the World Cup, owning some of the most valuable football clubs on the planet, and shipping liquefied natural gas to power homes from Tokyo to Berlin. Look at Saudi Arabia, once an isolated kingdom of tribal warriors, now attempting to build cities that look like they belong in a science fiction movie. How did this happen? How did a collection of desert territories nobody cared about transform into some of the most powerful, influential, wealthy places on the face of the Earth? The answer involves geology, timing, strategic genius, and a series of decisions that changed not just the Middle East but the entire global order. The story begins with oil, but it does not end there. Before the 1930s, the Persian Gulf region was known for one thing above all else: pearls. For thousands of years, divers from what is now Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the coastal areas of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates would plunge into the Gulf waters, holding their breath for agonizing minutes, scraping oysters from the seabed in hopes of finding those precious white spheres that wealthy women in Europe and Asia would pay fortunes for. This was not glamorous work. It was brutal. Divers would tie stones to their feet to sink faster, hold their breath until their lungs screamed, and surface with bleeding ears and damaged eyes. Many died. Many returned to their families with nothing. The entire population of the Arabian coast, somewhere around 60,000 people by some estimates, was involved in this pearl trade in some way. It represented 95% of local incomes. And then in the 1930s, two things happened that seemed at first like disasters, but turned out to be the beginning of something nobody could have imagined. First, the Japanese figured out how to cultivate pearls artificially. Suddenly, those precious Gulf pearls were not so precious anymore. The market collapsed. Families that had survived for generations on pearl diving found themselves with nothing. The second thing that happened was that American and British geologists started finding oil. They found it in Iran first back in 1908, then Iraq in 1927, then Bahrain in 1932, and then in March 1938 at a site called Dammam No. 7 in Saudi Arabia. After years of drilling and failing, after investors were ready to give up, the drill finally hit what would turn out to be the beginning of the largest oil deposits on the planet. King Ibn Saud, who had only recently unified the warring tribes of Arabia through decades of brutal conquest, had sold his oil rights for almost nothing just a few years earlier because he needed the money and because nobody really believed there was anything valuable under all that sand. That decision, made out of desperation, would turn out to be one of the most consequential transactions in human history. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Saudi Arabia alone sits on roughly 17% of the world's proven oil reserves. The 6 nations that would eventually form the Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Oman, together control about 30% of global oil production and roughly 55% of proven reserves. These tiny countries with tiny populations suddenly found themselves in possession of the most valuable substance on Earth. But having oil is one thing. Knowing what to do with it is another. And here is where the story gets interesting, because the Gulf states did not become powerful simply because they got lucky with geology. They became powerful because of what they did next. For the first few decades, Western oil companies controlled everything. Companies like Aramco, which was really just a consortium of American giants including Exxon, Chevron, Mobil, and Texaco, extracted the oil, refined it, shipped it, and gave the local rulers a small cut of the revenues. The local rulers were grateful for even that. It was more money than they had ever seen. But as time went on, a few leaders started asking uncomfortable questions. Why should foreign companies take the lion's share of profits from resources that belong to our land? Why do we let them set the prices? Why do we have no say in our own destiny? The answer came in 1960, when Saudi Arabia, along with Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and Venezuela, formed the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC was not immediately powerful. For more than a decade, it was mostly an irritation to the major oil companies, a group of countries making noise about prices without any real leverage. That changed in October 1973. The Yom Kippur War broke out when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during the Jewish Holy Day. Israel initially struggled, and the United States rushed to provide military support. Giant American cargo planes landed in Israel during daylight hours, in full view of the world, delivering the weapons that would help turn the tide of the war. The Arab world watched this. Saudi Arabia's King Faisal had warned Washington that supporting Israel would have consequences. Washington did not listen. So the Arab members of OPEC did something that seemed crazy at the time. They announced an oil embargo against the United States, the Netherlands, and any other country that supported Israel. Within weeks, oil prices quadrupled, from around $3 a barrel to nearly $12. Gas stations across America ran dry. Drivers waited in lines that stretched for miles. The American economy, which had been growing confidently for decades, suddenly realized how dependent it had become on imported oil. The psychological impact was enormous. The most powerful country on Earth had been brought to its knees not by military force but by a handful of desert nations turning off a tap. The embargo itself did not achieve its stated political goals. Israel did not withdraw to its 1967 borders, but it achieved something perhaps more significant. It announced to the world that these Gulf nations were not just resource colonies to be exploited. They were players, they had leverage, and they intended to use it. The money that flowed into the Gulf after 1973 was staggering. Oil revenues in Saudi Arabia alone jumped from around $600 million in 1965 to $26 billion by 1975. That is a 40-fold increase in a single decade. Similar transformations happened in Kuwait, the Emirates, and Qatar. These countries suddenly had more money than they knew how to spend. Some of it went into immediate development. Roads appeared where there had been only sand. Hospitals rose from the desert. Schools opened their doors. Air conditioning became common, transforming life in one of the hottest regions on Earth. But the Gulf leaders also understood something crucial. Oil would not last forever, and the price of oil was volatile. They needed to do something with this wealth that would outlast the oil itself. This is where the sovereign wealth funds came in. Kuwait actually started the trend back in 1953, even before the major oil boom, setting aside a portion of revenues for future generations. Abu Dhabi followed in 1976 with what would become the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, now one of the largest investment pools in human history. The logic was simple but brilliant. Take the temporary wealth from oil, invest it in assets around the world, and create a permanent source of income that would continue generating returns long after the last barrel was pumped. Today, the scale of these funds is almost incomprehensible. Abu Dhabi alone manages sovereign wealth funds totaling somewhere around $2 trillion. That is more than the entire economies of countries like Spain or Australia. Qatar, with a population smaller than some cities, controls investment funds worth hundreds of billions. The Saudi Public Investment Fund holds close to $1 trillion and is spending it on everything from artificial intelligence to sports teams to futuristic cities. These funds own pieces of virtually every major industry on Earth. When you walk into certain luxury hotels in London or New York, there is a reasonable chance that a Gulf investment fund owns it. When you watch certain football teams play, Gulf money is often behind them. When major tech companies raise funding or when infrastructure projects need capital, Gulf sovereign wealth funds are frequently at the table. This financial power translates directly into geopolitical influence. Countries that might otherwise lecture the Gulf states about human rights or political reform find themselves in an awkward position when they need Gulf investment to bail out their banks or fund their projects. The relationship between the Gulf and the West became a kind of mutual dependence. The West provided security guarantees, military equipment, and technical expertise. The Gulf provided oil at reasonable prices, invested their surplus dollars back into Western economies, and served as strategically located allies in a turbulent region. This arrangement was formalized in what some call the petrodollar system. Oil would be priced and traded in US dollars, reinforcing American currency as the global reserve. Gulf countries would park their massive dollar reserves in American treasury bonds and Western assets. In return, the United States would guarantee Gulf security, a promise tested when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, and American forces led a coalition to push him back out. But the Gulf states were never just passive recipients of Western protection. They played their hands skillfully. They maintained relationships with multiple powers, refusing to put all their eggs in one basket. When American attention waned, or when Washington made demands they did not like, they had options. They could talk to the Europeans. They could do business with the Chinese, who by the early 2000s were buying more Gulf oil than anyone else. They could develop their own military capabilities and regional alliances through organizations like the Gulf Cooperation Council, formed in 1981 as a response to the threats from revolutionary Iran and the chaos of the Iran-Iraq War. Qatar's trajectory offers perhaps the most dramatic example of a small country punching far above its weight. This is a nation roughly the size of Connecticut, with a population, excluding foreign workers, of well under 500,000 citizens. It should, by all conventional measures, be a footnote, a minor player at best. Instead, Qatar became one of the most influential countries in the world. The story centers on natural gas. While its neighbors focused on oil, Qatar realized it was sitting on something even more valuable in the long term. The North Field, an offshore gas reservoir extending into Iranian waters, contains roughly 13% of all proven natural gas reserves on Earth. It is almost impossible to exaggerate how big this is. Unlike oil, natural gas is cleaner burning and increasingly in demand as countries try to reduce emissions while still needing reliable energy. Qatar saw this coming and invested billions upon billions in infrastructure to liquefy natural gas and ship it anywhere in the world. By the 2000s, Qatar had become the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas on the planet. Revenue poured in. The Qatar Investment Authority, the country's sovereign wealth fund, grew to hundreds of billions of dollars and went on a spending spree that captured global attention. They bought the legendary London department store Harrods. They acquired significant stakes in Volkswagen and Barclays Bank. They purchased Paris Saint-Germain Football Club and filled it with some of the most expensive players in sports history. They won the right to host the 2022 FIFA World Cup, an event that, whatever controversies surrounded it, forced the entire world to pay attention to a country most people could not have found on a map. Qatar also developed an outsized diplomatic presence. It positioned itself as a neutral mediator in conflicts ranging from Afghanistan to Sudan to Lebanon. It hosted opposing factions that would not speak to each other anywhere else. It launched Al Jazeera, a news network that, whatever one thinks of its editorial choices, became arguably the most influential media outlet in the Arab world and a genuine alternative to Western narratives. For a country this small, this level of influence was unprecedented. The United Arab Emirates took a different path to power, focusing on building global cities from scratch. Dubai and Abu Dhabi each had oil, but Dubai had less of it and used what it had to create something entirely new. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum envisioned Dubai as a global hub for tourism, finance, trade, and entertainment. He built it through sheer ambition and a willingness to attempt things no one had tried before. The Palm Jumeirah is perhaps the most iconic example. An artificial island shaped like a palm tree, extending 7 kilometers into the Persian Gulf, visible from space, home to luxury hotels and private villas and entertainment complexes. The engineering alone was staggering, requiring millions of cubic meters of sand and rock dredged from the seabed and shaped into something that should not exist. And the palm was only the beginning. The World Islands, another artificial archipelago shaped like a world map, followed. Ski slopes in the desert, indoor beaches, indoor snow, underwater hotels. Each project seemed more impossible than the last, and each one got built. The Burj Khalifa deserves its own mention. When it opened in 2010, it was not just the tallest building in the world. It was taller than anything that had come before by a substantial margin. Standing 828 meters high with 160 floors, it announced to everyone that Dubai was not interested in being second best at anything. The building incorporated Islamic geometric patterns into a modern design, synthesizing heritage with futurism, in a way that became something of a Dubai trademark. But Dubai's success was not just about physical spectacle. It was about creating an environment where global business wanted to operate. Tax-free zones attracted companies from around the world. Relatively relaxed social codes by regional standards made it a place where Western executives and tourists felt comfortable. A strategic location roughly equidistant from Europe, Africa, and Asia made it a natural hub for aviation and logistics. Emirates Airline, owned by the Dubai government, became one of the largest and most prestigious airlines on Earth, serving as both a profit center and a global advertisement for the city. Abu Dhabi, with its larger oil reserves and more conservative approach, became the quieter but perhaps even more powerful partner in the Emirates. While Dubai grabbed headlines, Abu Dhabi quietly accumulated the kind of wealth that could bail out its flashier neighbor when the 2008 financial crisis hit and Dubai's real estate bubble burst. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority invested patiently around the world, taking positions in blue-chip companies and prime real estate and infrastructure projects across 6 continents. Today, when people talk about the Emirates as a financial superpower, they are really talking about Abu Dhabi's deep pockets backing Dubai's showmanship. Saudi Arabia, the largest and historically most conservative of the Gulf states, is now attempting its own dramatic transformation. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who effectively took power in 2017, launched Vision 2030, a comprehensive plan to diversify the Saudi economy away from its dependence on oil. The ambition is breathtaking. Saudi Arabia wants to become a global hub for tourism, entertainment, technology, and investment. It wants to reduce unemployment, increase women's participation in the workforce, and build entirely new cities from the ground up. The most famous of these planned cities is Neom, a $500 billion project in the Northwest Desert that includes something called the Line, envisioned as a linear city stretching 170 kilometers through the mountains with no cars, powered entirely by renewable energy, housing up to 9 million people. The concept videos look like science fiction. Whether the Line or any version of it can actually be built at anything close to the original scale remains to be seen. Recent reports suggest significant scaling back of the plans, but the ambition itself says something about how Saudi Arabia sees its future. Saudi Arabia has also aggressively moved into sports as a tool for both reputation and genuine economic development. The Saudi Public Investment Fund purchased Newcastle United Football Club in England, instantly making it one of the wealthiest clubs in the sport. Saudi Arabia has hosted boxing matches featuring the biggest names in the sport. It has lured golf's most prestigious players to a rival tour backed by Saudi money. It has bid for major international events, including potentially the FIFA World Cup. Critics call this sports washing, an attempt to improve the country's image through athletic spectacle rather than substantive reform. Supporters argue it is simply a form of investment and soft power projection that many countries engage in. Either way, it has undeniably raised Saudi Arabia's profile on the global stage. The Gulf states have also become increasingly important diplomatic players. Kuwait mediated the resolution of a severe internal rift within the GCC itself when Saudi Arabia and its allies blockaded Qatar for several years over accusations of supporting terrorism and getting too close to Iran. Oman, the most neutral of the Gulf states, played a crucial role in back-channel negotiations between the United States and Iran that led to the nuclear deal. Qatar has maintained relationships with parties across the political spectrum in the Middle East, talking to everyone from Hamas to Israel to various Afghan factions, making itself useful as a go-between in situations where other mediators cannot operate. This diplomatic influence stems partly from financial leverage, but also from geography. The Gulf states sit at one of the world's most critical choke points. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage between Iran and the United Arab Emirates, carries roughly 20% of all oil traded globally. Any disruption there immediately registers in fuel prices around the world. This makes stability in the Gulf a matter of direct concern for every major economy, giving Gulf leaders a seat at discussions that countries of similar population size would never be invited to. The relationship with the United States deserves particular attention because it has been so central to Gulf power. American military bases dot the region. Qatar hosts Al Udeid Air Base, one of the largest American installations outside the continental United States. Bahrain is home to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. American troops and equipment are stationed across Kuwait, the Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. This military presence has provided a security umbrella that allowed Gulf states to focus on economic development rather than having to build large conventional militaries of their own. But the relationship is transactional on both sides. The United States gets access to bases, reliable energy markets, and vast recycling of petrodollars into American financial markets. The Gulf gets protection against regional rivals like Iran and, perhaps equally important, validation of their government's legitimacy. American administrations have generally been reluctant to push too hard on issues like human rights or political freedom in the Gulf because the strategic relationship is considered too valuable to jeopardize. This dynamic is now shifting. The United States has become a major oil and gas producer itself, thanks to the shale revolution, reducing its direct dependence on Middle Eastern energy. American foreign policy attention has increasingly focused on competition with China. Some Gulf leaders worry that Washington's commitment to their security is no longer as firm as it once was. In response, they have quietly diversified their relationships. China is now the largest buyer of Gulf oil. Chinese investment in Gulf infrastructure is growing. Russia maintains working relationships with several Gulf states despite tensions with the West. The Gulf is not abandoning its American partnership, but it is hedging its bets, ensuring it has options no matter how the global power balance shifts. The social transformations within these countries are equally remarkable, even if they remain works in progress. Saudi Arabia, once one of the most restrictive societies on earth for women, now allows women to drive, to attend sporting events, to participate in the workforce in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Entertainment venues, movie theaters, concerts featuring international artists, things that were forbidden are now part of Saudi life. Religious police who once patrolled the streets enforcing strict dress codes and prayer attendance have been stripped of their powers. Critics point out that this liberalization has occurred alongside crackdowns on dissent, that activists who advocated for the very reforms now being implemented have been jailed. The murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 shocked the international community and raised serious questions about the darker side of Gulf governance. These contradictions are real and should not be glossed over, but neither should the genuine changes in daily life for tens of millions of people in the region. The Gulf states have also positioned themselves at the forefront of emerging technologies. The UAE established an artificial intelligence ministry and has invested billions in AI research and infrastructure. Saudi Arabia is pumping tens of billions into AI through partnerships with global tech companies. Qatar is building smart city infrastructure. These investments are partly about economic diversification, but they are also about ensuring relevance in whatever world comes next. If artificial intelligence and renewable energy and other technologies eventually reduce global dependence on fossil fuels, the Gulf wants to be a leader in those new industries rather than a casualty of the transition. Climate change presents a particular irony for the Gulf states. The very substance that made them rich is also driving environmental changes that make their already brutal climate even more extreme. Summer temperatures that regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius may become literally uninhabitable without air conditioning. Rising sea levels threaten coastal developments, including many of the artificial islands. The Gulf states have therefore begun investing heavily in renewable energy, even while continuing to profit from fossil fuels. The UAE hosted COP28, the major international climate conference. Solar and wind projects are under development across the region. There is a recognition, at least among some leaders, that the energy transition is coming whether they like it or not, and they need to be on the right side of it. The labor system that built these modern Gulf cities also deserves mention because it has been controversial. The construction of everything from the Burj Khalifa to Qatar's World Cup stadiums relied heavily on migrant workers from South Asia and elsewhere, who often faced difficult conditions. Passport confiscation, wage theft, unsafe working environments. These problems were documented extensively by human rights organizations. Some reforms have been implemented. Qatar abolished its kafala system that tied workers to specific employers. Working conditions have improved in some areas, but the Gulf's development model remains fundamentally dependent on large populations of low-wage foreign workers who do not have paths to citizenship and whose rights are not always protected. What does all this add up to? The Gulf states have accomplished something extraordinary. In less than a century, they transformed from some of the poorest places on Earth to some of the richest. They accumulated financial reserves that give them influence far beyond their populations. They built cities that did not exist from nothing. They positioned themselves at the center of global energy, finance, diplomacy, and increasingly culture and sports. They turned geographic disadvantage into strategic advantage. They made themselves necessary. Whether this constitutes being the most powerful place on Earth is debatable. Military power still resides primarily with the United States, Russia, and increasingly China. Population and economic scale still favor the traditional powers. But by certain measures, the concentration of wealth and influence in the Gulf is genuinely unprecedented. A handful of small countries with a combined citizen population smaller than many individual cities wield influence on the global stage that simply would not have been imaginable a century ago. The future is uncertain. Oil and gas will eventually decline as the world transitions to other energy sources. The timeline is disputed, but the direction is clear. The Gulf states know this, which is why they are investing so heavily in diversification. The question is whether they can complete the transition before the revenues dry up, whether they can build economies that function on human capital and innovation and services rather than extraction. There are reasons for skepticism. Creating a knowledge economy requires more than building fancy buildings. It requires educational systems that produce innovators, legal systems that protect entrepreneurs, social environments that attract global talent. The Gulf has made progress on these fronts, but deeply entrenched practices and power structures may prove resistant to the changes needed for a truly post-oil economy. There are also reasons for optimism. The financial resources available for the transition are enormous. The willingness to take risks and attempt bold projects is evident. The geographic location between Asia, Africa, and Europe is not going away. And the demonstration effects of what has already been accomplished should not be underestimated. Cities that once seemed impossible now stand. Institutions that seemed fantastical now function. Perhaps the most audacious visions of the next phase will prove equally achievable. What is undeniable is that the Gulf has rewritten the rules about what is possible for small nations in the modern world. They proved that natural resources, if managed cleverly, could be transformed into lasting power. They proved that geography could be overcome through technology and investment. They proved that money, deployed strategically, could buy influence that guns sometimes cannot. They proved that in a globalized world, being at the right crossroads and controlling the right resources could make you indispensable regardless of your size. The fishermen and pearl divers who lived on these shores a century ago could never have imagined what would rise from the sand and water. Neither could the Western geologists who first came looking for oil or the bankers and engineers who followed them. Something happened in the Gulf that defied expectations repeatedly, that kept confounding those who said it could not be done. That story is not over. The Gulf states are still betting on themselves, still building, still maneuvering, still reaching for more. And whether you admire them or criticize them, you cannot ignore them. That in itself is their greatest accomplishment. They made themselves impossible to ignore.